Hi there, my name is David Tingstad. I'm a lawyer at Beresford Booth. I chair the Business Mergers and Acquisitions group here, and we thoroughly enjoy what we do. Today, I'm going to talk about the process of buying and selling a business. Frankly, it's a little bit of a mystery. If you look out there, people don't know exactly how to do it, how to buy a business, how to sell a business. This is not in the publicly traded world. This is in the private transactional world of buying and selling a business. And so today, I'd like to talk about that process, which there are basically 5 steps to it. You usually start with a confidentiality agreement once you've identified a business to buy or a buyer of your business, whether you meet at a trade show or over dinner, or you find that you have a broker that introduces you to someone. That process has all kinds of different iterations once you find a prospective purchaser, but it's really important that you have these conversations in the context of everything being confidential. From once you have share some information, then there's enough information to talk about a price. And that's when you'll get to either a letter of intent or a term sheet. Once you have agreement on that, you move to a definitive agreement, which is what I spend a lot of time working through that process. And then the closing process where money and documents change hands. And then there'll be a post-closing process that deals with covenants not to compete, things of that nature. So what I'd like to do is talk a little bit more about each of these various processes. So let's talk about a confidentiality agreement for a minute. Most of the time, you deal with a mutual confidentiality agreement where both the buyer and the seller share information and both sides agree to keep it confidential. It needs to be properly drafted. And these are usually not very long agreements, but everyone agrees, hey, if we're going to share financial information, for example, that information is going to be kept confidential. Why would you want to share financial information? Well, a buyer is not going to know a price to pay if they don't see the income and expenses of a business, what the assets, what the liabilities are. And oftentimes they'll look even further, even in this early stage. And so you start with a confidentiality agreement for both buyer and seller. Hopefully it's mutual. And I strongly recommend you talk to counsel for purposes of getting a good confidentiality agreement and making sure you understand what's in it before you sign it. Once the confidentiality agreement happens and there's a sharing of information, a buyer is going to be able to put together their own valuation information. And then you're going to talk about the structure of the transaction. Are we buying assets? Are we buying stock? Are we buying a membership interest in an LLC? What are we buying? When's it going to close? And these are things that you talk about in a term sheet or a letter of intent. They're kind of used interchangeably. They're often done in a bullet point format, and they're not binding. But I will caution you as you go down this road that if you're a seller, that if you think that you're going to agree to a price and then negotiate up from there because it's not binding, practically it does not work that way. If you're the buyer, if you think you're going to negotiate the price downwards after the term sheet, it just does not work. Again, it's not binding. You're not required to buy for that price, but I would simply encourage you to be really thoughtful about agreeing to these terms. And when I say agreeing, obviously I'm holding up air quotes because it's not binding, meaning you have to close, but it's just practically hard to modify that. So talk to counsel, talk to your accounting folks as you put together the term sheet to make sure you understand the tax consequences associated with the structure of your transaction. So typically the only contractually binding portion of a term sheet is going to be 2 things: exclusivity and confidentiality. And with exclusivity, the seller is agreeing that they're going to exclusively deal with the buyer for some period of time. So effectively, the business comes off the market, and you're only going to deal with that buyer. And similar, the buyer now is willing to devote some more resources to the transaction because they know, aha, the seller is serious. We've got an understanding, and they're going to only deal with me, so they can't shop this term sheet to someone else. Similarly, the term sheet or the letter of intent the terms of that and the existence of that are also going to be confidential. Many times a term sheet or a letter of intent have their own exclusive, or excuse me, their own confidentiality provisions, but sometimes they don't. They simply say, hey, all of this remains subject to that confidentiality agreement we signed a while ago. So you go from simply sharing information in the confidentiality phase to now, okay, let's get down to, let's have something more tangible. That what's the price? What are we selling? What are we buying? And when are we going to close kinds of transactions or conversations? From there, we move on to the definitive documentation, the definitive agreements. So now, instead of a letter of intent that is not binding, now you move on to, okay, we're going to prepare a full asset purchase agreement, a full stock purchase agreement, or a full membership interest purchase agreement. There are going to be ancillary documents in addition to that. There might be employment agreements. There might be an earnout. There might be a transition services agreement. All a part, there might be a holdback agreement that's a part of that, an escrow agreement. But the main document is going to be a purchase agreement of some kind that is going to be contractually binding. It's going to contain the purchase price. It's going to contain what is being bought and sold. It's going to contain what is not being bought and sold. It's going to be excluded. There'll be a whole long list of representations and warranties that the seller is going to provide so that give the buyer comfort for that what they're buying is what they think it is. There'll be some language about closing. When is the deal going to close? What's the checklist for what's going to get exchanged at closing? Where's the money going to go? Is it going to be exclusively money? Is the purchase price going to be money and equity? Lots of different iterations with that. There'll be post-closing covenants, like a covenant not to compete or a non-solicitation provision. There'll be an indemnification provision, which are typically inordinately complicated, and it's really incumbent upon you to deal with good counsel so you can deal with those provisions competently and make sure that whatever you're doing it with your eyes wide open. And so you'll have full definitive documents. They're going to be quite lengthy, quite involved, and it's quite an expensive process to work through, which is why you don't start with that process. It's why you start with a letter of intent or a term sheet. Then you get to closing. Buyer pays in the money, the seller gets the money, but the buyer gets all of the assets that are purchased or the stock that is being purchased, the membership interest in an LLC that's being purchased. That's the fun part. It's because it's a lot of work to get up to that closing process, but that's when everything is exchanged. Buyer pays money, seller either sells the stock, the membership interest, or the assets. Then after closing, you're still not done yet. There'll be a process of the seller is not going to be able to compete or not going to be able to solicit the buyer's employers, their former employees. And there's also typically a true-up process that deals with things like working capital to adjust the purchase price that may happen after closing because you just don't have all the information right at closing. So again, you start with a confidentiality agreement, letter of intent, a definitive documentation, then you close. After closing, there's still more to do. So this is quite a lengthy process, and I'd strongly encourage you as early as possible in the process to deal with competent counsel. Certainly, we'd be happy to help. Our business, mergers and acquisition groups, does tons of deals every year. Always in the privately held world, and we'd be delighted to help your business in this process. So give us a call. Again, my name is David, last name Tingstad. I'm at Beresford booth, and we're here to help you.